I'll just point out that whilst I was head of hydro up until about 6 or 8 weeks ago, I'm now part of the integration team for AGL, which has recently acquired Macquarie Generation in New South Wales, so that's my role. So I'm not pretending to speak as an academic authority, and I'm not a HR specialist. I'm not anything else except an electrician, a technician, an engineer and an engineering manager. So rather, I'm going to share experiences and observations, my own and others, and hope to identify my learnings so far, which hopefully will advance all of our current understanding and excite our future thinking about this particular topic. So the structure I've settled on for this talk is to look at a typical job or career cycle in the industry and consider the implicating factors at various points in that career flow which help or hinder the entry and sustainability of women in our industry. And I say our industry, and what do I mean by that? I mean we as individuals, we as employers, we as governments, we as educators, we as unions. No one's off the hook here. So the waypoints on a career path that I'm looking at, firstly, is our historical legacy, which is even before someone considers becoming a tradesperson or an engineer. I'll look at attracting and selecting recruits, the experience of women in workplaces and the workplace response, that is the peer response to those people. And I'll look at our industry's response to those women. Then I consider how might we get a critical mass of women into our industry, and then I'll think about what's next. So I talk fast, so I hope you can listen fast. So firstly, with the historical legacy. So my mother was born in the 30s. She completed school to go to work before she turned 15, which is not an unusual story for the rural working class of those economically depressed times. Also not unusual was that in her 20s, when she married my father, she was compelled to leave a good job in the public service as a telephone exchange operator. That then was policy for government jobs, many government jobs in those days. I asked my mother, who's now in her 80s, why didn't they just live in sin, and she nearly had a conniption. Anyway, I wonder what was and what is the effect of that type of policy on the thinking of the people born of that generation. So that's the people now in their 40s, 50s and 60s, and I can see you, who grew up in households where women were either directly compelled or subtly or unsubtly pressured to cease work and become homemakers. For example, for me, what was the influence on educational policy in the late 70s when I was not allowed to study tech drawing in a state high school because I lacked a Y chromosome? And what influence did it hold for a female colleague of mine, Helen, who around the same time started an engineering cadetship, and who in all the company systems was naturally classified as a male because cadetships were not open to women? Remember the day of the job advert columns, positions for men, positions for women, they were separate. So I wonder about this influence, because those people in their 40s, 50s and 60s seem to me to be the people who mostly now are leading governments, heading our companies, our educational institutions, our unions, and are holding reasonable influence in our society. But let me tell you about a bloke I'll call Mr. M. Let's call him Mr. M because I purposefully tried not to use the word bloody scumbag in my speech. By the time I was a third year electrical apprentice, which was last century, I was relatively good at the trade and I was very industrious. So I got to work with the protection technicians. I was in transmission, and they were an elite group who designed and maintained complex control systems to ensure that when a fault occurred on the high voltage system, it would be cleared quickly. So this group was under the control of a temporary acting team leader, Mr. M. At one stage in that group, I'd spent weeks and weeks and weeks fabricating and wiring all these complex protection panels for a new substation that had been built. And it was a couple of hundreds of kilometres away from base. So when it came to the actual installation at the substation, which meant a few nights with the team away from base, I was the only member of that team not selected by Mr. M to go on that assignment. Why, I asked, in possibly a less than perfectly calm manner. As he explained it, Mr. M and his wife, whom I'd not had the privilege to meet, were apparently conservatives, dedicated to particular thought around family structures and gender dynamics. And they, plural, thought that going on assignment overnight with the team would place me at grave moral risk. Well, all I can say is that in the ensuing dialogue, I certainly traded their sense of grave moral risk with my sense of moral bloody outrage. But you say, we have generational change upon us, and that was then. Well, was it? There's a fascinating paper from the US, and I said I read fascinating papers. You might want to jot this down. It's called The Implications of Marriage Structure for Men's Workplace Attitudes, Belief and Behaviours Towards Women. And it's dated March 2014. That's this year. And when I say fascinating, I mean from an academic perspective, because personally reading it left me in a state of incandescent indignation. But the researchers looked at a number of studies which engaged about 1,000 married heterosexual men in the US. What they found was that men in traditional marriages, that is married to women who are not employed, which is about 20% of the US population, those men disfavour women in the workplace, are more likely than average of all married men to take decisions that prevent the advancement of qualified women. They thought workplaces operated less smoothly with women about. They were less attracted to work in workplaces that were headed by women. And sadly, men entering into traditional marriages reverted to less favourable attitudes towards working women. This is a study from March this year. So what do I learn from this? Learning number one. If we're anything like the North Americans, and I suspect we are, then we have a historical legacy with which we have to contend across all facets of women's working lives. And 20% of men's not an inconsiderable number. Generally, we may have generational change, but there's a bit of a generational anchor as well, and that's holding us back still. So let's look at my next part of the topic, attracting applicants. So how can we get more capable, more as in more numerous, capable female candidates to apply for energy sector jobs? And how can we get organisations and companies to recognise and employ them? Let me quote from some of the feedback I received when I asked around work about what women thought was working and what wasn't working for them in our company and in our power sector. And they range between sort of 20s and 50s. So some of these quotes. My daughter is 16 and she's just started year 12 and she has no idea what she wants to do. A day's presentation on different roles from us, AGL, would be brilliant. Maybe an open presentation to power station females explaining the whole set of options they've got open to them would be great. Third one, I actually didn't realise the energy sector employed chemists, and furthermore I thought it would be dirty and very physical, which was a bit off-putting. I commenced employment at the power station 24 years ago as a cleaner labourer with no industrial skills and limited knowledge of the power station. Can you see a pattern here? There's a lack of recognition about what the roles are and how people get into them and what's available to them. There's a paper again from the US, from Boston, called Evaluation of the Engineer Your Life Initiative. Now, the Engineer Your Life program is partly a product of a coalition of 105 engineering organisations, societies, departments, unions, the entire cross-section of the sector, with the goal of creating understanding of engineering for women, inspire women to consider it as an option, and help young women investigate their opportunities. So the program contends that the most commonly reported barrier to young women was their lack of familiarity with the engineering industries. The study found that young women developed increased interest and better understanding of the full range of skills needed in engineering, and that includes communication skills, people skills, group and organisational capability, imagination and creativity, which accompany the usually understood positivistic skills of maths and science. So this program sought to redress that, and they seem to be going pretty well. In terms of understanding of trade roles amongst young women, the story anecdotally looks fairly similar. However, there are some avenues developing that I've found to help address this. For example, there's a website called the Women New South Wales SALT Partnership. So Women New South Wales being a government entity and SALT being a support network supporting and linking tradeswomen, SALT. According to their website, the group supports and profiles tradeswomen, provides advice to women about trades, and they have a Try a Trade trailer. Sounds like something I'd like to have in my backyard. And here in Western Australia, if any of you were here yesterday, you will know about the fabulous Trade Up organisation. Thanks in large part to a fairly recently graduated electrician, Sarah Jane Flatters, whose passion for the trade and seeing more women has started a mini revolution. My question is, why does it take a recently graduated female electrician to create this mini revolution? Why wasn't the revolution already there? Anyway, it's a brilliant model and a great initiative. So my learning here, learning number 2, there's a gap in the knowledge of particularly young women regarding the vast array of opportunities available to them, both in the short term and whole career-wise. And there appears scant understanding regarding what a role in our industry really looks like in the flesh. So let's move to my third part of my topic. Let's consider selecting recruits. Okay, so one woman with whom I work started decades ago as a cleaner labourer in the power station and now holds a Cert 3 in Business Administration, a Cert 4 in Training and Assessing, and she applies all of this learning through cross-functional work engagement that complement her main role, which is being a technician assistant, for which she's also trained. She's clearly bright, she's clearly capable. So I wonder, why didn't she aim higher than that? Why didn't she aim higher than cleaner labourer all those years ago? An article I read called Deconstructing the Glass Ceiling talks about stereotypical cognitive biases, which is really the biases that we have to contend with in our industry. These biases can lead to underrepresentation of women through a number of pathways. So, on the one hand, we have it affecting the self-belief and confidence of women. So these biases reduce self-belief, causing women to self-select out of recruitment and development opportunities. On the other hand, we have these biases that create negative reactions to women who happen to assert authority or happen to self-promote. So on one hand, we've got lack of confidence. On the other hand, we've got too much confidence. We're damned either way. So maybe that woman did aim higher all those years ago, but maybe she might have been nobbled. There's a collection of papers put out by an organisation called CEDA called Women in Leadership, Understanding the Gender Gap. And there's a discussion in that about whether selection processes are truly meritocratic. Christine Nixon, who was once Victoria's police commissioner, and whom I do not hold responsible for my collection of driving demerits in that state, is referenced in terms of the selection criteria for police, where once they were required to be able to scale a 7-foot wall to be admitted. This task clearly, systematically excluded women who either failed or gave up trying. And the point in this paper was that in the huge range of skills that police officers have to deploy, this task was not even considered to be linked to future on-the-job performance. But even if it was, 33 years ago, if tech drawing was a prerequisite to starting an electrical apprenticeship, I would not be in this job right now. I would not be talking to you. I would not have had the career I had. I'd probably be teaching English and torturing students with Jane Bloody Austen or something, and that would not be good for anybody. But back then, while I had no tech drawing skills at selection stage, these were taught to me at TAFE. I got to practice in the workplace, got to practice at home, i.e. no big deal. So I think there could be a bit of a difference between apprenticeship ready and job ready. We need to distinguish between the two. So I suppose my learning here is that, learning number 3, we need to start to look a bit past the direct pre-qualifications and specific job skill acquisition for a role, particularly at entry level, and look at capability and potential and support the development of those skills once we get people into the process. And I acknowledge the discussion around capability in maths and literacy. I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about tech drawing, metalwork, all the things that you may or may not happen to have bumped across in your school life. Now let's think about women and their experience in the workplace and the workplace response, that is the peer response to women. So a couple of more quotes from my workplace. I have worked in a male-dominant industry most of my life, and I'm very comfortable with the working environment, though I can see how some people might be a bit intimidated by it. I've gained knowledge, skills and qualifications over my career with the support of my peers and my team members. 3, my interaction with co-workers and management has been very enjoyable, and I have formed friendships within the company. These are all women in power stations, just to remind you. 4, the men I work with, my peers, don't seem to treat me any differently than they treat each other. And the last one, there are still the very occasional chauvinistic males around the plant, but they seem to be, thankfully, a dying breed. Yes, well, I for one am happy to help them along that journey to extinction. My own experience is pretty similar, and I know it to be the same for a number of other women engineers that I worked with at Eraring, because we talked about it a lot. We formed our own society called GIRLS, G-E-R-L-S, Girl Engineers Recreation and Leisure Society, supported by Chardonnay. Our conclusions were, for the most part, and we estimated 99%, for the most part, the men we work with and the men who work for us, are respectable, respectful and pleasant people. For the most part, a job in the energy industry is supported and nourished by our team leaders, who in the case of all of us had always been men. For the whole part, the workplace peer pressure that we have witnessed being generated by the good men we have worked with has been better than mere tolerance, better than neutral acceptance, and has reached towards positive appreciation of the value of women bring to the job. So that, 99%, woohoo. But that 1% of baddies, and in a typical power station that could be 2 or 3 blokes, they can really mess up your day, they can really mess with your career, and they can really mess with your confidence. So my learning here, which is learning number 4, while it's great to have increasing numbers of women in our industry, we need good men to mentor us, because we are still too few, to continue the positive peer pressure along that continuum from begrudging tolerance to positivity, to recognise our contribution, and from time to time to advocate on behalf of women in industry as a positive phenomenon. Okay, so we're on the home run. Let's think about our industry's response to women. When I say industry, as you know, I've said government, unions, employers, etc., etc. My question, why would a woman leave our fabulous industry once she was in? Good question. Well, let's first start with equal pay. There have been a couple of articles lately, and some in 2013 by Anne Summers and one by Benjamin Priest in the Sydney Morning Herald, which talk about the disgracefully widening pay gap. But I want to talk to you about an article I read a while ago called Qualitative Analysis of Career Paths of Women in the Trades 2001 to 2010, which was a report for the Office of Women's Policy in the New South Wales Department of Family and Community Services. It contemplates lots of interesting data, but there are 3 bits of telling information for my money. First, at the peak of their career earning capability, females working in traditionally male roles earned more than women working in traditionally female roles by about 2%. That's good. I thought, women in men's roles earning a little bit more, great, I'm happy with that. Secondly, women working in traditionally male roles earned less than men working in traditionally male roles by about 16%. Now that's pretty bloody annoying, but sadly wasn't really surprising given that what I'd read from Anne Summers. Third, and this was a surprise, women working in traditionally female roles earned less than men working in traditionally female roles, and that was by about 20%. In the idiom of contemporary social media, WTF? Question mark, question mark. Do tradeswomen ever get to win? Why shouldn't they feel belittled and infuriated? How can we hope to keep them if they'd be better off becoming baristas or English teachers? The industry, us as a group, and no one's off the hook, we need to really respond to this inequity, and we need to do it now. Happily, one of the quotes from my company, a big one is the equal pay opportunities. The fact we are paid on a skills-based salary system allows women to earn exactly what men do for the same work, and that's really very satisfying. I could talk a lot about the poor compatibility between family and work rhythms, particularly in a 24/7 process like power generation, and particularly as women still carry the major part of the nurturing responsibilities. And I've got a number of quotes from women saying that flexible work hours only seem to be available for people with newborns, and that the option of working from home when you've got a sick kid without actually taking sick leave yourself would be an absolute godsend. And to me it seems like the whole flexible work patterns, accessible, affordable childcare, work from home when the tiddler's unwell scenario seems to be really difficult. I can see that there is a generation change on this front with younger fathers who've worked for me being very involved with their children's welfare and care. But it's still a tough challenge for all parties, and companies like mine, with the very best of intentions, still struggle to get it right. It's one challenge with no easy solution, and while we don't address it, it costs us as an industry the loss of those capable women. So just to get a couple more quotes about the industry's response to women. Maybe if they had facilities for women's in the workshop, it would feel a bit more inclusive. Well, what can I say? Things haven't changed much. This is a quote from a female technician at work from a couple of weeks ago. And when I was a technician on shift, while we were commissioning Mount Piper about 22 years ago, there were toilet, bathing and change facilities for men, and there were toilet, bathing and change facilities for wheelchair-bound people. Nothing for women. Now, I wasn't unhappy that the disabled were contemplated in the power station design. I was just a bit perplexed that the wild, crazy concept of women in that work environment had not even occurred. Still seems it hasn't. So I was assigned to the disabled facilities, and with the shower rows at waist height, meaning I did learn to bathe on my knees. But another quote about what doesn't work mentioned the poor availability of women's work clothing and the fact that women who have to wear the clothes usually don't get a bit of input into what they look like. Just don't get me started. After 33 years, I still have to get my PPE work shirts, which are men's shirts, altered, i.e. the size of the shirt that accommodates the physiology has to have the knuckle-dragging length of the sleeve shortened. And I can only thank my mother for that, and I have to say thanks to the public service, because I'm so glad her career was curtailed all those years ago that she could learn to sew. While I joke about these aspects, and individually they seem minor, but in aggregation they're a bit of a burden. Theoretically an easy fix, but they seem impossible to get right, and the fact that women today are still mentioning them, and they were issues 33 years ago, is a bit disappointing. On the other hand, what do we get right? Okay, here's another quote. I've been encouraged to embrace opportunities, partaking in skills development programs and the instrument and control course. So development is something we seem able to get right if we try, and in particular if we don't have too many men married to non-working women in our workforce. I'm an example of someone who's developed from an apprentice to an engineering manager, supported by my employers through trade, engineering and business courses, supported and mentored by my team leaders and peers, and able to partake in opportunities with relatively unhindered, to create a career. And it's possible, and it's turned out good value for all parties. I've given back. I am so dedicated to giving back because I've been given so much. So the learnings for myself and perhaps for our industry are, learning number 5, do the things you know you should do, pay fairly and provide equitable work conditions. Support women on their career journey because still they are often the sole woman in the organisation. Ask the women and the men who work for you how the home and work rhythms may be made more harmonious. That's to the benefit of both parties and will be the benefit of society. Getting close to the end, how might we get a critical mass of women in our industry? For a sustained process where women enter trades and engineering based on their choices, based on the merits of those roles to them and their own merits, without sort of normative judgments and stereotypical undercurrents, I think this requires a critical mass of women in those roles and operating as leaders in those organisations. I suspect this is where we now enter the dangerous and murky territory of the vexed question of affirmative action. I realise we could spend eons just on this topic alone, but I'll just be brief. There's a lot of opposition to quotas, which variously have been claimed to engender tokenism, realise poor fits for roles, and be a wee bit heavy-handed. Organisations, companies, educators, unions, governments, etc., they tend to steer more towards targets which are sort of voluntary-ish and aspirational. For my money, that's a great start. AGL has a goal of appointments to its leadership feeder group to be 50% by 2016. That's a great goal. And it's written in black and white in the 2013 annual report on page 48 at the top of the centre column if you just want to check. I think I memorise it off by heart. Some say that affirmative action is disadvantageous for men and creates an uneven race. Well, my personal response from my experience in our industry is that often women don't even have the opportunity to get to the starting line of the race, let alone compete in the race. I don't want to be unfair to anyone. However, so far as affirmative action goes, I would like to see it implemented only in precisely equal proportion to the discrimination women have faced. It's not about overtaking, it's about catching up. I think I've achieved some success in my career independent of affirmative action, but Jesus, it would have been a lot easier if the discrimination likewise had been absent. It takes a bit of, if it takes a bit of positive force to overcome the negative, then I think it's worth consideration. I appreciate that that's a bit confrontational for some people, but I'm sure if we got our heads together, we could derive a more congenial solution. So what next? Well, that's a good question. For every learning I've recognised, and I think there were 6 of them, I can't remember, there's probably an action. Historical stereotyping legacies need to be recognised, understood and managed, or we could just shoot old sexists. We, governments, unions, organisations, educators, individuals, must work to close the knowledge gap regarding what young women know about our industry and how they experience it. And that could be targeted education for young women, roadshows, mentoring, targeted workplace experience, preferably with a women's support network somewhere nearby, if not in that company's precisely somewhere nearby. We should take a chance and hire some people based on potential for a role rather than job-specific skills like tech drawing that they may or may not have encountered. For good blokes are mission critical as leaders, mentors and advocates. We and they need to recognise this, and we need to train and guide them. They're doing it well, but some of them don't even know they're doing it. The industry must play and pay fair, to create equitable work environments. Additionally, we need to think about that home-life harmony. And we need to become a bit more creative about how we engage in affirmative action, quotas, goals, etc., to try and get to a sustainable critical mass of women. That could be things like industry scholarships or pre-apprenticeship type courses that just have girls so that they get a chance to find their feet, and support networks generally. All of these things, all of these solutions occur in patches with varying support and resourcing and with various success. They work well in some places, but in my experience, in some areas, little has changed in 33 years. So this is where we take a dive to the future. I've been reading a book called Appreciative Inquiry, A Positive Revolution for Change. And what we're talking about here is change, and I've been talking about change all day. That's what we've been talking about. The premise of this book is that how you approach a change situation can determine the solution that you achieve. The authors compare a problem-solving approach with what they call an appreciative inquiry approach. So the problem-solving approach assumes our changes and things in our organisations are problems to be solved. So they go through the standard problem-solving process, which I'm sure all you technical and industry people are pretty comfortable with. That is problem identification, analysis of causes, solution generation, solution selection, action planning, action, etc. Very linear kind of process. A characteristic of this approach, though, is that, say, for a fist-sized problem, the best we usually get is a fist-sized solution. Often that's fine. Mostly that's what we've done, and mostly that's created the change that we have had, and that's good. Appreciative inquiry, they say, though, approaches change situations almost as mysteries to be embraced. It does this by looking at and valuing the best of what is right now, but then envisioning what might be, unhindered, unbounded. Have a think about what could be, what do we want to see. Then having a dialogue about that and thinking about action afterwards. So mostly what I've been talking about regarding female participation in the energy industry has been through that former methodology, and so far it's turned out some good results. We've got legislative and educational outcomes that are supportive. We've got organisational and societal mores that are heading in the right direction, but none of it's fast enough for my money. What if we were to ask ourselves to envisage the ideal situation, the ideal situation where we're at a point where a dialogue like this now becomes some sort of distant anachronistic memory, where women are represented in our industry in numbers commensurate with their representation in society. What if we could start at that point with that vision, unbounded, and then work backwards? Then we might get something more ingenious than a fist-sized solution. So hopefully after a few more years' study, I might be able to figure out if that's a realisable approach or not. I'm at the very beginning of that. Okay, that's enough for me. So thank you for your attention. Thanks for the opportunity.